In the quiet suburbs of Westport, Connecticut, where old money meets the New England coastline, there stood a house once owned by the legendary talk show host, Phil Donahue. Though he had long since passed, his legacy lived on perhaps in more ways than one. The house itself was a stately colonial revival, perched atop a gentle hill with panoramic views of the Saugatuck River. It had been Donahue's sanctuary, a place where he had entertained guests, reflected on decades of interviewing America's most intriguing figures, and, according to rumors, wrestled with personal demons in his later years. After his passing, the house sat vacant for a while, waiting for its next chapter. Enter the new owners, Greg and Olivia Hampton, a couple in their late 30s who had made their fortune in the tech industry. Olivia, a former journalist, had always admired Donahue's work, while Greg, a software developer, simply loved the idea of owning a piece of media history. They purchased the property at a generous price, considering its past owner, and moved in with their 2-year-old son, Theo. At first, the house seemed perfect. Spacious, elegant, and filled with natural light. It had the charm of an old-world estate with modern renovations. But then, strange things began to happen. One evening, Olivia decided to explore Donahue's old study, a room left largely untouched by the previous owners. It was here that he had kept a small studio, a private space where he recorded thoughts that never made it to air. As she sifted through old tapes and papers, she felt a sudden chill despite the summer heat. Then came the whisper. At first, it was indistinct, like a radio frequency struggling to tune in. Then clearer. "Let's talk about it." Olivia froze. The words were unmistakable. It was Phil Donahue's signature phrase, the way he opened difficult conversations. She turned, expecting to find Greg behind her. The room was empty. Greg was the skeptic of the two, always quick to dismiss things as faulty wiring or quirks of an old home. That was until the television incidents began. They had installed a brand new flat screen in the living room, but every night at precisely 2:37 a.m., it would turn itself on. At first, it seemed random, but then Greg started noticing something unsettling. It never played modern channels, only static-filled broadcasts of old interviews. Most disturbing of all, one night, a blurry image flickered on the screen, an old recording of Donahue himself, staring straight ahead. Then the sound kicked in. "Greg? Olivia? Are you listening?" The television shut off by itself. Greg barely slept that night. Their son, Theo, was too young to understand what was happening, but he began talking to someone they couldn't see. At first, it was dismissed as toddler imagination. Kids often had imaginary friends. But one evening, as Olivia was putting him to bed, she heard him giggle and say, "Okay, Mr. Phil, I'll ask Mommy." Olivia's heart nearly stopped. "Ask me what, sweetie?" Theo turned to her with bright, innocent eyes. "Why don't you believe him?" She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that he must have overheard their conversations. But the feeling of unseen eyes never left her. Determined to get answers, Olivia started researching Donahue's final years in the house. She discovered that, toward the end of his life, he had become obsessed with unfinished conversations, interviews he had never conducted, debates left unresolved. He had spent his last nights recording monologues to the void, as if still trying to reach an audience that no longer existed. Then, one night, everything escalated. The family was awoken by a loud bang. Rushing downstairs, they found the study door wide open, despite locking it before bed. On Donahue's old desk, his vintage microphone had been placed upright, perfectly centered, as if waiting for someone to speak. And on the dusty leather chair, an imprint, as if someone or something had just been sitting there. That night, Olivia made a decision. They moved out within a month. The house sat on the market for over a year before another buyer took the plunge. The new owner? David and Laura Kensington, a retired couple from Boston who had never heard of Phil Donahue. They weren't interested in ghost stories, only in the beauty of the home. For a while, they reported nothing strange. The house seemed calm. But then, Laura began waking up at 2:37 a.m. every night, and sometimes, just before she drifted back to sleep, she swore she could hear a voice in the dark. Let's talk about it. The Kensingtons had moved in just as the last of autumn's gold faded into the skeletal fingers of winter. Their first days in the house were spent in the warm, hollow hum of unpacking, the rustling of tissue paper, the scraping of furniture legs across polished floors, the quiet exclamations of rediscovered belongings. David, a retired professor of American literature, had fallen in love with the home's towering bookshelves, their mahogany frames stretching toward crown-molded ceilings, still carrying the scent of old paper and time-worn varnish. Laura, a former interior designer, admired the symmetry of the house's architecture, the way the rooms seemed to flow into one another like chapters in a well-structured novel. To them, the house was a story waiting to be rewritten. But some stories refused to end. The first time Laura woke at 2:37 a.m., she thought nothing of it. She had always been a light sleeper. She sighed, shifted onto her other side, and let her gaze settle on the faint glow of the hallway night light, its soft amber hue cutting a path toward the staircase. The house was quiet, save for the occasional crack and pop of settling wood, a sound she had learned to tune out in all the old homes she had designed over the years. Then, beneath the quiet, something else. A murmur. Not a voice exactly, but the suggestion of one, an indistinct cadence woven into the silence, like a radio barely within range. She held her breath, listening. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It was inside the bedroom. David stirred beside her. She could feel the rise and fall of his chest, steady, undisturbed. He heard nothing. Laura exhaled slowly, trying to convince herself she had imagined it. She closed her eyes. And yet, just before sleep reclaimed her, the murmur came again. Closer this time, as if it were waiting. It was a week before she mentioned the disturbances to David. He had spent most of his days lost in his study, the walls lined with books inherited from past scholars, the heavy oak desk swallowed by stacks of annotated manuscripts. He seemed at peace in the house, thriving in the quiet. Laura, on the other hand, had begun to notice things. The radio in the kitchen would flicker to life on its own, always tuned to static. The television in the den would refuse to change channels, no matter how many times she pressed the remote's worn rubber buttons. But it wasn't the television that unsettled her. It was the whispers, the same ones that had started in the bedroom. They were growing bolder now, no longer confined to the witching hour. They drifted through the air in daylight, curling around the edges of conversations, slipping beneath the hum of running water, settling into the spaces between words. One afternoon, she had been folding linens in the laundry room when the sound came again, clear this time. A voice. "Are you listening?" Laura dropped the bedsheet. The words had been sharp, insistent, spoken directly into her ear. She spun, expecting to see David standing behind her, but the room was empty. And yet, the air still carried the faint vibration of speech, as though the words had not yet fully dissipated. She pressed a trembling hand against the cool porcelain of the laundry sink, her pulse drumming in her throat. David dismissed her concerns at first. "Old houses make noise, Laura. And honestly, I think you're psyching yourself out with all those ghost stories." But even he could not deny what happened next. One evening, as he sat in his study, preparing notes for an article he planned to publish, his attention was drawn to the antique radio perched on the bookshelf. He had always admired its craftsmanship, a relic of an era when voices traveled the airwaves like spirits in a machine. He had never tried to turn it on, assuming it was merely decorative. But as he sat there, pen in hand, the dial began to move. Not in the erratic way of a loose knob, but deliberately, controlled. The static sharpened, the white noise shifting, coalescing into something that had form, structure. A voice, faint at first, then clearer. "Let's talk about it." David's breath hitched. He turned slowly, his gaze fixed on the radio's glowing face. The voice was unmistakable, a relic from television's golden age, a voice that had once filled living rooms across America. It was Phil Donahue. But that was impossible. David stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, his pulse hammering. The voice continued, low and steady, as though picking up mid-conversation. "You don't believe me. But I need you to listen. Then, with a sharp crackle, the radio fell silent. David stood frozen, the air around him thick with something unspoken. He could almost feel it pressing against him, a presence waiting just beyond the veil of understanding. Laura found him there minutes later, still staring at the silent radio, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "David!" Her voice was soft, uncertain. He turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. "I think we made a mistake moving here, but the house was not finished with them yet. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The house had grown colder. Not in the way of winter creeping in through unseen cracks, nor the way an old furnace struggled to push warmth into distant rooms. This was something else, something beyond the reach of logic. A chill that lingered in doorways, that coiled around the ankles of those who passed through, that settled into the marrow of the walls themselves. Laura first noticed it in the mornings. She would wake to find the bedroom unnaturally cool, the air thick with the damp weight of something unseen. She checked the vents, adjusted the thermostat, but the cold remained, untouched by reason. It was worse at night, when she lay in bed and listened to the shifting silence of the house. Because that was the thing, it was never truly silent. The murmurings had continued, growing bolder, weaving themselves into the rhythm of their days. Sometimes Laura would hear them when she passed through the hallway, an indistinct voice threading itself between the notes of a distant memory. Other times it was clearer, like the night she stood in the kitchen, rinsing plates beneath the warm rush of the faucet, and a voice low, close-breathed against her ear. "Are you listening?" The plates slipped from her fingers, shattering against the porcelain sink. She spun, hands trembling, but there was nothing, just the empty space where something had been a moment before. David found her minutes later, still gripping the sink's edge, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What happened?" His voice was thick with concern. Laura could barely force the words past her lips. "He spoke to me." David stiffened. He didn't need to ask who she meant. The next day, Laura found the tapes. It was an accident, or at least that was what she told herself. She had never been particularly interested in the old boxes stacked against the far wall of the study, their cardboard lids sealed with the brittle remnants of aging tape. They had been there since they moved in, left behind by previous owners who either hadn't cared enough to sort through them or had simply been too eager to leave. But now she felt drawn to them. It was an odd feeling, as though her hands moved before her mind had made the decision. She knelt on the wooden floor, dust rising in thin streams as she pried open the first box. Inside, rows of old cassette tapes, their plastic cases clouded with time. Each one was labeled in the same careful handwriting, a neat, slanted script that felt familiar. The labels were simple. Dates, times: 1979, March 15th, unaired; 1984, October 3rd, midnight recording; 1996, May 28th. My final thoughts. Her breath caught. The final tape was smaller than the others, the plastic cracked at one corner. The label, though faded, was unmistakable. Phil Donahue. The conversation never ends. Laura hesitated, her fingers hovering over the tape. A whisper of cold air brushed against the back of her neck. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked open. She swallowed hard, grabbed the tape, and stood. That night, she waited until David was asleep before slipping into the study. The old tape recorder had been left behind by a previous owner, tucked away on one of the lower bookshelves, its buttons stiff with disuse. Laura placed the tape inside, pressing down on the play button with the careful hesitance of someone opening a door they were not meant to pass through. For a moment, only silence. Then a crackle, a hiss of static. And then, "I hope you're listening." The voice was unmistakable. Phil Donahue. Laura's throat tightened. The sound quality was rough, the kind of grainy distortion that came with age, but the words were clear. "I tried to finish this conversation before I left. I really did. But some things don't end just because we do." A pause. A shuffle of movement. Then softer, closer. "Are you listening?" Laura's fingers dug into the edge of the desk. The voice was no longer coming from the tape. It was coming from behind her. She turned, slowly, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The study was empty, and yet, she could feel it, that same weight in the air, that presence pressing against the edges of the room. The tape continued playing. There are things left unsaid, stories unfinished. And if you found this, then you must know it too. A breath of static. A shift in tone. Don't go yet. We need to talk. The recorder clicked off. Laura stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She reached for the tape, her hands trembling as she ejected it from the player. The plastic felt warm in her palm, as though it had absorbed something beyond just sound. Presence. A memory. A voice that refused to fade. She turned to leave the study, but before she could take a step, something in the dim light of the room caught her eye. The old microphone on the desk, the one they had never used, the one that had been collecting dust since the day they moved in, was no longer where it had been. It was upright now, perfectly centered. Waiting. Laura backed away from the desk, her breath shallow, the warmth of the cassette still pressing into her palm. The microphone, standing tall and expectant, seemed to hum with an energy she could not explain. The study felt smaller now, the shadows in the corners stretching longer than they should. The walls themselves seemed to lean in, pressing closer, listening. She had the overwhelming sense that she was no longer alone. From the hallway, she heard the distant creak of floorboards. Not the casual settling of an old house, nor the subtle shift of temperature against wood. These footsteps had weight, intention. Someone was moving through the house. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, but the doorway was empty. Just the long, yawning darkness of the corridor beyond. Then, "Are you listening?" The voice was clearer this time, rich with the same timbre she had heard in decades-old recordings, but layered with something else, something frayed, weary. It was not the voice of a television personality broadcasting to an audience. It was a voice reaching out across time, pleading. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, the door to the study slammed shut behind her. The wind rushed through the room, scattering papers from the desk, knocking over books in violent, clattering tumbles. The old radio in the corner crackled to life, flipping through stations with a frenzy, voices overlapping in rapid succession, fragments of interviews, debates, questions left hanging in the air. Then, all at once, silence. The microphone in front of her flickered, its red light blinking to life. Laura felt a pull, deep in her chest, an invisible hand guiding her forward. She reached out with trembling fingers, hesitated for only a moment, then pressed the button on its side. "I'm listening," she whispered. For a long moment, nothing. The house held its breath. Then, the voice returned, quieter now, almost relieved. "Thank you." The cold in the room lifted. The air settled. The microphone light blinked once more, then faded to black. Behind her, the door creaked open. The next morning, David found her sitting in the study, the old cassette tape still in her hands. She had barely slept. When she told him what had happened, he didn't argue. He didn't try to rationalize it. He simply sat beside her and listened. The house, it seemed, had quieted. The static had faded. The whispers had stilled. That night, they packed their bags. They had made up their minds before the sun had fully risen. This was not their home. It never had been. By the end of the week, the house stood empty once more, the echoes of its history sealed behind locked doors. But just before they left, as Laura stood in the threshold one last time, she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Good night, America." And then silence. Laura stood frozen in the doorway, the last of their moving boxes stacked neatly in the back of the car, David already behind the wheel, waiting. "Good night, America." The whisper had been soft, almost lost beneath the rustling wind, but she had heard it, clear as day. She turned slowly, eyes sweeping the empty foyer, the grand staircase stretching upward into the dim silence. The house had always felt too big, its halls too deep, its rooms too eager to swallow sound. But now it felt lighter, not empty, but at peace. Her fingers brushed the old brass doorknob, its once cold metal now warm beneath her touch. It was over. She stepped outside, closing the heavy oak door behind her with quiet finality. As they pulled away from the house, she couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. For a moment, just before the house disappeared from view, she could have sworn she saw it the faintest glow of red, blinking softly in the study window. A microphone light, and then it was gone. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.